Now let's take those principles and apply them to community ecology. So now, instead of talking about the population density and distributions of single species, we're now talking about the connection of multiple species within a community. So let's talk about this key integral relationship between different species in terms of predation. Here we have perhaps what looks similar to what we saw a couple slides ago with a boom and bust. This, however, is the predator-prey cycle. Here we have data from the lynx and its prey item, the snowshoe hare. We have 200 years of trapping data, and this shows that we have a cycle between predator and prey that lasts about 10 years, with predator populations lagging about 1 to 2 years behind that of the prey population. So just to orient you, we have the time in years on the x-axis going from 1845 to closer to present day here. And then we have thousands of animals represented on the y-axis. The red color represents the prey item, the hare, and the blue item represents the lynx. And so here we'll have the increase in the hare, followed by a decrease in the hare, and an increase in the hare, and a decrease in the hare. So just looking at the hare alone, you would see a boom and bust, but what's controlling that is the population of the lynx. So here, let's break this down. When we have an increase in hare numbers, that means that we have more food available for the lynx population. Therefore, the lynx population is going to increase. And we see, just looking at a couple of these ebbs and flows, that population increase in the lynx lags about 1 to 2 years behind that of the hare. Now, once this cycle continues, the lynx population grows, kills off a whole lot of hares, and therefore declines the hare population. Now, with less food available, the lynx population is going to decline because it simply can't find enough food. With that low lynx population, the hare population is then able to rebound and increase again because of low predation pressure, and that cycles again and again and again. So what are some defenses against predation and against herbivory? We have a couple of different mechanisms that are used by animals in nature. Some are pictured here, and they fall into several categories. First, we have mechanical defenses. These are things like thorns or a hard shell or even strategic positioning, rolling yourself up into a little ball like this millipede, making yourself perhaps too big to eat in one bite. We also have chemical defenses, specifically toxins that are emitted by flowers or just happen to be present in their flower structures. Next, we have physical defenses against predation. These again can fall into different types. We have camouflage, either body shape, so maybe a stick bug or an insect that looks like a leaf or a plant, or camouflage in terms of color, like our chameleon. We also have something in nature called aposematic coloration. This is just a fancy word for warning colors. This is when an organism has bright colors to say, hey, leave me alone, I'm dangerous, or a very striking pattern of fur like the skunk that says, hey, I'm pretty nasty, you should probably not mess with me. We also have another category falling under physical, and that's mimicry. In nature, there are several different types of mimicry, and they're all really fascinating. There's a YouTube video for you to watch about mimicry, but we'll just break them down very briefly here. First, we have something called Batesian mimicry. This is when a harmless species imitates warning colors of a harmful species. And this really only works when there are a whole lot of harmful species in a community, so that when you are a Batesian mimic, you get easily misrecognized as something that's pretty nasty. Next, we have Mullerian mimicry, and this is when multiple species share the same warning coloration, but actually all of them do have defenses. They might taste bad, they might actually be a little bit poisonous, but they all kind of look similar to each other. Next, we have something that is called Mertesian mimicry, also called Emilesian mimicry. And this is a little bit more rare, a little bit more contrived. This is when a deadly prey mimics a less deadly one, such as the venomous coral snake mimicking the non-venomous milk snake. So here we have the scarlet king snake on the right, non-venomous. It says non-poisonous, but we should remember that there's a difference between venom and poison. Poison is something that you eat that will kill you, and venom is something that a snake has, for example, that can be injected into you and kill you. So I don't know where this came from. I'll change that. Another type of defense against predation or herbivory is behavioral. And my favorite example is playing dead. This is an image of an eastern hognose snake, probably my favorite snake. And they roll over onto their backs and they hold open their mouth and they pretend like they're dead when they're scared. It's very cute. Same thing with a possum. That's the example you're probably more familiar with, but my favorite is the eastern hognose snake. All right, so shifting gears from defense, let's talk about competition between species that prey upon the same thing. Here we have something called the competitive exclusion principle. And this simply states that two species cannot occupy the same niche in a habitat. And that's because they are going to directly compete with each other for resources, whether that is a nutritional source or a prey item. And here we have an example of the exclusion principle practiced by two different types of paramecium. So when we grow these two paramecia together, we have time and days on the x-axis and number of cells. Notice that one is doing far better than the other. So here we have P. aurelia over here in green, and then in purple we have P. caudatum. So one is clearly outcompeting the other. However, when we grow these alone without a competitor in the environment, they both do very, very well. And so this is an example of the competitive exclusion principle where P. aurelia clearly outcompetes P. caudatum, and therefore the presence of one will eliminate the presence of the other. Let's talk about relationships that aren't necessarily related to the principle of exclusion. Instead, they are symbiotic. These you probably have heard before, but we'll just run through them again. First of all, we have commensalism. This is a situation in which one species benefits from a close, prolonged interaction, and the other species is neither benefited or harmed. And this is most commonly seen in the relationship between birds and trees, where the birds are using the trees as nesting sites, but the trees aren't necessarily harmed or benefited from the presence of the bird. Next, we have mutualism. This is when two species benefit from their interaction with each other. This is considered by some ecologists the only type of truly symbiotic relationship, with the others being closely associated but not true symbiotic relationships. So an example of a mutualistic relationship is protozoa living in termite guts to digest the cellulose that the termite eats. As you all know, termites eat wood, and wood is full of this compound called cellulose. It's very difficult to digest. In order to digest it, you have to have special enzymes. And oddly enough, even though this is what termites eat, termites do not make those enzymes to degrade cellulose. Instead, they rely on their mutualistic protozoa that live in their gut to make those enzymes, therefore release the nutrition from the wood and cellulose that it consumes. So that is a key example of a mutualistic relationship. Finally, we have something called parasitism. This is where one species lives on or inside a host species, and that relationship deprives the host of its nutrients. The parasite is, of course, benefiting while the host is harmed. And an example of a parasitic relationship is the pork tapeworm, where it grows inside of pork, and then as a secondary host, it can grow inside humans that eat undercooked pork. It uses the pig and the human as a vector for survival, reproduction, and passing on its genes. So all of these represent close interactions between individuals of different species. And these interactions can extend over a long period of time, changing the abundance and the distribution of the associated species. And these species may or may not play crucial roles in the community. So let's talk about the different roles that species can play in their communities. Number one, you can be a foundation species. Foundation species are the base of the community and have the greatest influence on community structure. This is because they can physically modify the environment to produce and maintain habitats that benefit the other organisms that use them. An example of this, of course, is the coral in a coral reef ecosystem. The coral itself is not photosynthetic, but it provides shelter for the photosynthetic organisms that live inside of the coral. But in addition, when we have lots and lots of coral, we create this reef habitat that can be used as shelter for other organisms like fish. Next, you could be a keystone species. The keystone species are species that are needed to maintain the biodiversity of a community. One key example of a keystone species is the intertidal sea star. Okay, and these are important because they control mussel populations. Mussels are their prey item, and so they keep their populations pretty low, regulated, and controlled. If we were to remove this keystone species, this sea star, the mussel population would explode, therefore decreasing the biodiversity within that specific habitat. And it's for this reason that we call the sea star a keystone species. Next, we have invasive species. Invasive species are any species that are non-native, and when introduced to an area out of their native range, they threaten the balance of the entire habitat, of the entire community. In the United States alone, we have many, many different types of invasive species, from insects to plants to birds. But something that you're probably most familiar with seeing is kudzu. And kudzu is not native to the Southeast in the US. In fact, it's native to areas of Asia, and it was introduced to the Southeast for decorative purposes. And because our climate here is so amiable, it's so temperate, we don't really have a cold winter season, the kudzu is able to proliferate year-round, and it is left to grow unchecked, like literally swallowing up other trees. You'll probably see this most often along highways. It was used to greenify the highways, and as you can tell, it has gone out of control. There is a TED Ed video for you to watch about the kudzu. So all of this rolls into something called community dynamics. Community dynamics, simply defined, is the changes in community structure and composition over time. So sometimes these changes are induced by environmental disturbances, something very, very large scale like volcanoes, earthquakes, or even storms, sometimes fires, and of course climate change, which can roll into some of these other things that are environmental disturbances. And communities with a stable structure are said to be at equilibrium. But following a disturbance, like an earthquake or a fire, the community may or may not return to that equilibrium state. It may rebound very quickly, or it may go through stages. And this first stage of rebounding is called primary succession. This is when newly exposed area is colonized by living things. So for example, here we have an image of primary succession of a plant in a lava flow in Hawaii. So we call these plants who first colonized land that's newly created pioneer species, because they're pioneering the colonization of that new land. After that, we get what's called secondary succession. And this is when part of an ecosystem is disturbed and remnants of the previous community are still there. An example of this is oak and hickory forests that are cleared by wildfires. So after a wildfire, we will have pioneering species. Annual plants grow and are succeeded by grasses and perennials. Then beyond that, we have intermediate species, which is exactly as it sounds. We get shrubs and pines and young oak and hickory begin to grow. So we're not at the end yet. We're not at the end until we get to what is called the climax community, where we get mature oak and hickory forests. These remain stable until there's another disturbance. So this would be our equilibrium community.